Hello everybody, how is it going? Alright, so far we have talked in depth about both strings and variables. So now we are going to shift our focus towards numbers, which are equally as important in JavaScript. Numbers are used in all types of calculations and programming. Our score in a video game, adding the total of purchases, seeing how much money you owe. These are all examples of how numbers are used in programming. First, let's talk a little bit about integers before we can move on. A whole number is what we call an integer. Here are some examples of what integers will look like. 55, 78, 33333, 9, 67. All these are all examples of whole numbers, or what we call in programming integers. Next up are floating point numbers. Floating point numbers are the same as integers, except that they have a decimal place in them. 0.1, 0.55555, decimal 23 are all examples of floating point numbers. Lastly, we have scientific notation. We can even use scientific notation for calculations in JavaScript. Here are some examples, but keep in mind that isn't used that much, and don't worry if this makes much sense. You can use this just as reference. Here is an example of how we can assign a number to a variable of each of the different types of numbers that we just discussed. Do you notice something different here than when we assign variables to strings? The main difference to notice is that we assign a number to a variable, and when we do, we don't use quotations. Otherwise, our number will be treated like a string. Later on in this course, you will learn how to convert a string to a number, but for now, I want you to focus on the difference between the two and how we assign them to variables. Strings, we use quotations. Numbers, we just type the number in and leave out the quotations. That's the main thing that is important for now. Okay, so once that makes sense for you, we can move on to the next course, and we're going to be working more with numbers. As you progress through your JavaScript career and journey, you're going to realize that programs require you to do a lot of math. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at how we can use math to build a program in JavaScript that will tell a user how many days they have been alive for. But before we can do that, we need to learn how to do basic math in JavaScript. So let's begin. To add numbers together in JavaScript, we use the plus sign. A fancy word for the plus sign is also the addition operator. So here we are adding 9 plus 3. If we wanted to subtract 3 from 9, we would simply use the minus sign. If we wanted to divide two numbers, we would use the slash sign, shown like this. To multiply two numbers, we would use the asterisk symbol. Calculations in JavaScript are usually done when we take input from a visitor and use that input to come with our final outcome. Take our program that will calculate how many days you have been alive, for example. We are going to need to prompt the user and ask them for their age. Then take that number and multiply it by how many days are in a year. But how do we write that in code? Before we can do that, we need to talk a little bit more about doing calculations with variables. Let's say, for example, we were creating a game where a plumber had to save the princess from a giant turtle in his castle. Every time our player would grab a mushroom, he would gain 1 life. We could write something like this. Variable lives equals 3. Lives equals lives plus 1. What this line of code is saying is our variable lives is first equal to 3. We would then insert the second part of the code whenever a player collected a mushroom. It's basically saying lives equals the current value of lives, then adding 1 to that number, then the final number will be stored back in the variable lives. So at the end, lives would be equal to 4. There is also a shorthand version for adding in JavaScript as well, which is as follows. Lives plus equals 1. You can use either version you like, just pick the one that makes sense. So we're going to stick with the basic version just so you understand what it means. I have included a reference page in the external file as part of this lecture you can take a look at for a full list of shorthand syntax for doing calculations in JavaScript. So let's build our program. The first thing that we are going to need to do is we need to figure out what the visitor's age is. So we're going to have to prompt the user what their age is. So to make a variable, call it visitor's age, and then write the prompt command, something along the lines of asking them for their age. Once we have that all figured out, we could then create another variable, and we're going to call this one years alive. Basically, what this variable is going to do is we're going to take that string that they entered in and convert it to a number. And parse int does exactly that. So we're going to take our visitor's age here, insert it in the brackets here, and basically what this is doing is we're taking our visitor's age, taking the string from it, converting that string to a number, and then saving it as years alive. So now that our string is saved as a number, we can actually do some multiplication with it. So the next line of code, we need to take the visitor's years lived and multiply it by how many days are in a year. Okay, so now we're going to do our math. What we're going to do is we're going to take our years alive variable and we're going to multiply it by how many days are in a year. In this case, there are 365 days in a year. So basically, we're taking the user's years alive, taking that string, converting it to a number, then multiplying that number by 365, then making a document.write command and outputting that number and a string that we're going to create here. Seems a little bit complicated, but once you get in the hang of doing math and multiplication in JavaScript, it's not too bad. So here we have a nice little program that would tell somebody how many days they've been alive for. Pretty neat. So we're going to finish entering our strings here. Then once we are finished, we can save the program and then test it and see if everything is working correctly. Alright, so let's add in my age, which is 24. We can see I've been alive for 8,760 days. That seems like a long time. Just to be sure though, we're going to pick another number and enter it in here. And we can see that with 2, our multiplication is correct. So this program is working exactly as we intended to. Let's do one more just to be sure. Alright, awesome. Everything's working perfectly. You are now ready to work with the math object, which is very important for doing calculations in JavaScript. I'll see you guys in the next video. In today's JavaScript lesson, you are going to learn how to create random numbers using the math object. So for reference, in case you forgot, strings and numbers are two different types of objects, and these objects have properties. For example, a string can have a length property which outputs how many characters are in that string. Objects also have actions that they can perform, which we call methods in JavaScript. For example, we can take a string and add the lowercase method, which will change all the characters to lowercase even if we type them in capital letters. In this lesson, however, we are going to focus on the math object. So let's talk about that for a second. With the math object, we can do all kinds of advanced mathematical calculations. For example, if we go to the MDN, we can see that there is a math property for the math object that lets us calculate the square root of a number, or get the number of pi, which we use to calculate the area of a circle. We can also see all the methods listed on the side here as well. The main method that we are going to be looking at is the math.random method. So let's type this in and see what happens. I'll give this random number a variable as well so that we can write it to the document. Okay, so if I run the program, we can see a random floating point number between 0 and up to, but not including 1, is displayed. I'm going to hit F5 a few times, which is the keyboard shortcut for refresh, So you can see that every time we run a program, we do actually get a random number. But what if we wanted a whole number instead of, let's say, between 1 and 50? Well, what we could do is we could multiply our result by 50. If we run our program, we can see that we're getting a little bit closer to what we want. The problem is we still don't have our integer yet. Luckily, JavaScript also has a way for us to easily do this with the math.floor method and the math.ceiling method. Math.floor will round the number to the lowest integer, and math.ceiling will round the number to the highest. So if we wanted to make sure that we hit a number between 1 and 50, we would use the math.floor command just in case, so we don't get a 51 by accident. Now this might look a little bit complicated, but it's not too bad. Just try to follow along with me. In JavaScript, the code inside the innermost parenthesis happens first, then we work our way outwards. So if we look at this statement, the following happens. First, a random number between 0 and up to, but not including 1, is generated. Then that random number is multiplied by 50, then the decimal is rounded down. The code might be complicated, but the main thing that is important is that you understand what is going on here. We also add the +1 at the end, so that if we do get a possible 50, since we are rounding down, we can only get a max of 49. So that's why we have the +1 just in case. If we run our program, we can see that we now found a solution that gives us a whole integer between 1 and 50. So using all this knowledge that you learned in this lecture, let's create a program that generates a random number between 1 and 16. You've been working a lot with numbers and doing a lot of math in this section of the course. Don't worry, we're almost done. We just have a challenge and then a quiz, and you'll be done with this section. Your project for this challenge is to do the following. Create a program that generates a random number between 1 and what the user inputs. For example, your user inputs the number 20. Your program must then generate a number between 1 and 20. Then write it to the document so the user can see the random number generated. Like usual, see if you can complete this project on your own. If you get stuck or need help, come join me in the next video where I will walk you through the solution step by step. I wish you luck and let me know how you do in this challenge. Alright, so the goal for this challenge was to create a program that would generate a number between 1, whatever the user inputs, as a second number. Like usual, I encourage you to try this program on your own, but if you're stuck or need help, let's walk through this step by step. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a variable and call it user number. We're going to use the prompt command to ask the user to enter a number. Alright, so once we have that all figured out, we can then take that number and we're going to change that number to an integer by using the parseInt command. Remember that we need to type a variable into the brackets here. So now we're taking our floating point number and changing it to a whole number, or we like to call an integer. Next, we're going to take our whole number and then do our calculations for that number so that our number is going to round between 1 and whatever the user inputs. We're going to use the same code we used in the last video. But instead, we're going to use the variable user number instead of the 50 that we had before. Remember to add the +1 at the end. Otherwise, you're not going to hit the top number that the user inputs. Next, we're going to create an alert box and alert it, the user, what the random number is. I think I might have mentioned to write it to the page in the last, but that's okay. You can use the alert box fine here. Alright, so I think our code is good to go. we're going to save everything here and hopefully it all runs smoothly. Again, we can see here that we're prompting the user, asking them for a number, taking that number and changing it from a floating point number to a whole number, taking that whole number, then using our formula here to generate our number between whatever 1 and whatever the user inputs, and then we're just alerting it so that the user knows what the number is. Let's give it a run. Alright, so I'm going to enter a number here. Okay, we can see that a random number is generated. Let's do it again a couple more times, just to see that our program is working correctly. Alright, so I think we got a program that's working pretty fine. So again, I'm going to congratulate you guys if you managed to finish it on your own. If you needed help, that's fine too. You're pretty much done working with numbers. Then after this, we're going to move on to conditional statements, which are very strong and very powerful in JavaScript. I hope you're enjoying the course so far, and let me know what you think.